So first, under pollen-pistil interaction. So what do you mean by pollen-pistil interaction? That is, the interaction exists between the pollen and the pistil, right? So it is a process in which pistil recognizes the compatible or incompatible pollen through the chemical components produced by them. So what do you mean by this? Compatible or incompatible pollen, right? So first, what happens? We saw the production of male gamete, right? How the male gamete is produced. From the pollen, that is the generative cell, it forms the male gamete. And we also saw about the production of female gamete, right? So how the female gamete is produced. In the embryo sac, that is the 8 nucleated and the 7-celled structure. So we saw the production of female gamete, right? So here in the case of pollen-pistil interaction, so first in the stigma, that is the female reproductive part, the pollen comes and lands. So this is the pollen, it lands on the stigma. So this is the stigma, which is the female reproductive part, right? So it is the process in which the pistil recognizes whether the pollen is compatible or not. Because when the pollen lands on the stigma, that pollen may be either of the same species or of the different species. That is, it may be either compatible or not compatible. So that is recognized by the pistil. So when the pollen sticks to the stigma, so here the stigma secretes some substances. So the pollen swells up, right? So if the pollen is compatible, so if the right type of pollen, it lands on the stigma, the pistil accepts it. So it will accept it and it promotes the post-pollination events. So how the post-pollination events happening? That is, when the right pollen sits on the stigma, it leads to the formation of a pollen tube, right? So if the pollen tube is formed, it shows that the pollen is compatible. Okay, so if the pollen is compatible, the pistil accepts it and it promotes the post-pollination events. So the pollen grain germinates on stigma to produce a pollen tube. So how the pollen tube is produced? Through one of the germ pores. We saw the structure of the pollen, right? It is covered by an egg sign and internally it is an intine. So here in the egg sign, there will be germ pores. Germ pores will be present. So how the pollen tube is formed now? That is, there occurs a formation of the pollen tube through one of the germ pores. The pollen tube comes out of this egg sign through the germ pore, and the contents of the pollen grain move into the pollen tube. So here, when the pollen sits on the stigma, when it is compatible, it leads to the formation of the pollen tube. So how the pollen tube is formed? That is, it is formed through the germ pores and it moves, the contents of the pollen grain, it moves into the pollen tube. Okay, so now the pollen tube grows through the tissues of the stigma. So here, tissues of the stigma and style to reach the ovary. So this red line, it shows the formation of a pollen tube. So there are two types based on the number of pollen tube that is formed. That is monosiphonous and polysiphonous. So this monosiphonous means example is capsular. That is, only one pollen tube is formed, example. And for polysiphonous, the example is Malvaceae and Cucurbitaceae. So only one pollen tube emerges, then the condition is monosiphonous, example capsula, and polysiphonous, that is Malvaceae and Cucurbitaceae. Okay, so based on the number of the pollen tube that is formed, it is called monosiphonous or the polysiphonous. So clear?